Hello, I am Joanna Bourke. I am the principal investigator of the SHAME project, stands for, of course, Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And today I have the absolute wonderful privilege to be able to talk to Sameena Mulla, who is an associate fellow of the SHAME project. She is also an associate professor of social and cultural sciences at Marquette University in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and really thrilled to have you here today. Thanks for joining us. I would just want to start, obviously we want to talk to you about your work on sexual violence, but before we get to that, can you just give us a little bit of background about, how you came to this topic and, what your interests are more generally?
Absolutely. I write about this a little bit in my book, and I came of age as a young woman in the United States, and I think that is where many women get their experiences orienting to issues related to sexual violence, whether it affects you personally or your friends and networks and relatives. It's just part of coming of age in the US. And as a young college student, I found myself, and actually even in high school, surrounded by my friends, a teacher, people disclosing a lot of experiences of sexual assault to me. And so feeling very uncertain about how to support them and what one does, I began to read. I began to read in high school and college. And I think I started in the self-help genre because that's a pretty sensible place to start. And what I noticed is that a lot of those books, if they think about Robin Warshaw's Ms. Report, right? That is full of these types of accounts. They were incredibly helpful, but they were just a starting point. And I was very perplexed about how uniform those stories, those narratives were, but how diverse the experiences of the people who had come to me seemed to be. There was something that was a little bit off. And so from there, I sort of started to read more scholarly literature. And I fell in love with anthropology pretty late in my undergraduate career. And I thought to myself, how would an anthropologist go about doing this type of research? And I did an MA degree at the New School for Social Research for 2 years, where I did a historical project, because one doesn't really have time to do one doesn't really have time to do a historical research project really properly in 2 years either, but it seemed more feasible than doing field research. And so at that time, I was very interested in sexual assault and rape as a historical category and a legal category. And so I was working with archives from the post-Civil War era, adjudicating questions of sexual assault in the semi-formal, right, through congressional hearings. These aren't formal trials. In following the Memphis riots of 1868. And very quickly, one could see rape really being mobilized as a kind of political category, having to do with the presence of Confederate troops in these garrison areas and their interactions with local populations. And you also see this kind of weaponizing of the category, not to benefit the victims of violence, but to really benefit the political agenda of Congress in this era. And there are other historians who've also written about this. And so that is where I started. But when it came to my doctoral research, I really wanted to do field research. And so I spent some time thinking, just about sexual violence as a category and where I might situate myself. And I was very interested in this intersection between law and medicine, right, which both seem to have a claim on the category, right? It is at once a legal harm and also a challenge, a healing challenge, I would say, depending on what healing art you practice. It might be medical, it might be a nursing challenge, it might be a therapeutic challenge from a mental health perspective. So it seemed like the emergency room was the place to begin to tease apart how those different institutional stakes in the category were playing out. So that is my rather long journey.
Well, I'm pleased, as an historian myself, I'm pleased to hear that you started in history. But actually, when I was reading your book, it was the anthropological reflections that just really drew me in and changed the way I thought about this topic. I mean, for those listeners may not know, I mean, you've written this fantastic book called The Violence of Care. I mean, just the title itself just tells you a huge amount about what you're on about. And this book was published in 2014, New York University Press. Okay, and as part of this research, you were a participant observer in a emergency hospital. So you were right there on the battlefront, on the battle lines, if you like. Can you tell us something about the arguments in that book? And a lot of people, historians, anthropologists, have also reflected on your arguments. I mean, it made a real splash in the field. So something also about the reception of your work. I mean, that's two big questions, but there you go.
Well, I would say broadly, for all of us working in this field, there is absolutely this challenge of like how to conduct this research. And so with the questions that I had about, originally I thought to myself, well, what is the state's stake in this category of sexual violence? And I discussed this in The Violence of Care. And, this was partly why I was drawn to thinking institutionally. But, institutions, again, are not just a set of ideals. As an anthropologist, you're really interested in the practices. And I could not think of an ethical way to be present in this particular space. So as a participant observer, I was a really particular kind of a participant. I actually received training as a rape crisis advocate. And so I had a role in the hospital. And that role actually came first before my role as a researcher. And it's interesting because in some ways, what and how I could conduct my research. But I think anthropologists are very accustomed to those kinds of limitations because, even as I had this role to play as the patient advocate for the patients who were requesting accompaniment, it also opened up a whole set of relationships and institutional spaces, which I had clearance to write and think and analyze about, and that became the basis of this book. And the analysis, in The Violence of Care, kind of talks about the confluence of the rape crisis intervention as a distinctively forensic kind of phenomena that meets at the intersection of law and nursing care. And I think our assumption is that the kind of difficulties that emerge, because there is a lot of information that kind of looks at, or research, I should say, that looks at the kind of despondency of victims or their dissatisfaction with care or what they do or don't like about it. And one of the baseline assumptions is that it's the criminal justice investigation process that introduces a lot of the kind of lack of control and additional harm. And in the research, we talk about this as the second rape or re-victimization. And what was my experience and observation during my field research was that there is also a way in which the nursing care, situated as it is within a really particular American, East Coast, historically conscribed, racially divided context, also brings with it its own harms, right? So we can't just say that it's one side or the other, and it is absolutely the entanglement that creates more harm. And part of that harm is also rooted in our general lack of respect for nursing practice, which kind of demotes its importance and its value, which is extremely problematic, and also lies in the fact that it is a very feminized field, right? This is women. And if we hold it in relationship to something like law enforcement, which is very masculine, right, both in terms of its personnel and also in terms of its kind of operations and affects, then the nursing field in this particular case is often drawing its prestige from its association with criminal justice procedure. And so some of those basics of nursing care, which make nursing so effective in terms of its advocacy for patients generally, not just simply in sexual violence, but gets really dampened by this particular dynamic. So I was examining all of the distinctive ways in which these two institutional practices came together. But, you know, as an anthropologist with a very materialist bent, also constantly thinking about bodies and genetic material, and even something as fascinating as paperwork or forensic photography. And so I write about all of those things in The Violence of Care.
Yeah, I mean, the times in your book when you're just talking then about the importance of forensics and DNA, and one of the nurses, I think, in your book said DNA is the god of this field, this sort of this emphasis or de-emphasis on the material body, suffering body, vulnerable body in front of you, and this emphasis on collecting scientific matter, and also the and I guess my next question is about this role conflict that you touched on then, and that is that there was one instance in the book where you quote a nurse, a forensic nurse examiner, who is taking photographs of this woman, and then she says something, I hope I'm not misquoting terribly, but something along the lines of, "Hey, honey, you smiled then. We've got to do it again." Because, of course, she is aware that this is information that is going to be used in law enforcement and courts and everything. And so can you just give us a little bit more about that role conflict and why it is that actually the science wins out over
Interesting.
Yes. Well, science and law enforcement, I should say, wins out over that caring aspect of nursing.
I think that's a great question. And I like thinking about it as role conflicts because I think it's very, very important. And I say this every time I talk about my work to underscore that the nurses were passionate and dedicated and extremely competent people who genuinely care about their patients. And the form of care that they are practicing here is not one that puts their patients' comfort first. And this is a feature of nursing and medical practice, right, that extends beyond the context of sexual assault intervention. But the way it gets magnified in this particular instance, right, is something that needs to be unpacked, because you really are dealing with a patient population that is extremely vulnerable and could benefit from more advocacy in this particular situation. And I would say that what wins out is a kind of imagined idea of the efficacy of science, because of course, right, my colleagues in the criminal justice fields tell me what happens with this evidence, which is not a lot, right? It's not exculpatory, or it doesn't bring that certainty that people express when you have a nurse saying something like DNA is the hand of God saying it's you, right? And I talk about that in the next book, which is due out this year. There's a next book. So what actually happens, right, if you trace the entire project, and this is quite true, I think, in many different localities, is that when it comes down to the parties that are involved in these conflicts, they're not strangers to one another. So, you know, as a legal question, most of the time we're arguing about consent, right? And so you find DNA, perhaps, but then they say, yes, it was the defense, as this was a consensual encounter. Right? And that doesn't surprise anybody who's working in the field. But we're putting people through an awful lot in order to produce this evidence, right? And most of the research that we've seen thus far tells us, like, whether you're talking about injuries or photographs of injuries, or case notes about injuries, or DNA, there really is very little that actually unpacks the question of consent, right? There's no clear physical sign in that way. So the other underside of it is we are favoring this material evidence and its production as a kind of substitute for the human voice and people's experiences, right? And then if you look at what juries actually have to do, they have to learn about why there's no evidence. That's what's happening in the courts here in Wisconsin. And then they have to listen to people's testimony and decide that way anyway, right? And so there's this question, like, are we doing people a disservice by emphasizing so much forensic intervention? Intervention is very important. Should it be weighted towards the side of criminal justice investigation, or could it kind of balance with people's healing or therapeutic needs in a distinctive way? So there is a lot of role conflict, and it doesn't come from anyone's intentions, right? I mean, I think that's why it becomes an anthropological question for me. It's very easy to see that nobody goes to work as a forensic nurse saying, I want to make somebody's day harder, right? That's clearly off the table. So why does that continue to happen? Why do we have people who have these negative experiences? And it was really important for me to kind of find these cultural mechanisms that reproduce themselves over and over again at the expense of this patient experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's really eloquent. You know, your work, I was reflecting on it again today, and I was thinking, well, it's part of a fairly recent change in the way we look at sexual violence. This sort of new emphasis, it's not totally new, but there's something different about it on forensics, on technology.
Mm-hmm.
Within the academy in particular. So academics are working on this. I'm thinking of the work here in Britain, the UK, of Gethin Rees, for example. And I see you two as sort of working in kind of similar type fields. Why do you think this has become such an important way in, if you like, to looking at, to understanding sexual violence in our societies?
I know Gethin Rees very well.
He's also an associate of our Shame.
Yes, because I think we first met at a 4S meeting, you know, the Society for the Social Studies of Science, which is this wonderful cross-disciplinary space. And as an anthropologist, I think that we're drawn to these questions of technology and science because we want answers. And we, you know, as meaning-making animals, we want answers to a really fraught question. And there is, with sexual violence, a sense in which it impacts so many people, right? I am not alone in saying I know so many people who have come to me for assistance and support. And here we are having this, I love the acronym of SHAME because it's so silencing. So here we have this experience, right, that is so common across so many different individuals in so many different geographies and under different historical conditions. And then we also have, perhaps not a fully resourced, but a fairly extensive, equally complicated set of interventions and institutions, but we can't talk about any of it. Because, and I'm in the US, and we're very good Puritans here culturally, I would say, and have so much difficulty even talking about sexual health in a positive framework when things haven't gone wrong. And so then you introduce this layer of violence and coercion, and everyone just really shuts down. And so what does that do to people when they need to be able to talk, to read, to make sense of what's happened to them, to support loved ones, to rethink care in ways that might increase efficacies in a way that we haven't thought about previously. And I think there's also something about STS or science technology studies where it feels like there might be some answers there, but it also somehow is evacuated a bit at the surface level from some of this kind of emotionally challenging content, perhaps, right? Am I going to be talking about shame and silence if I'm just talking about a DNA swab, or can I just give an account of what that is? And so there's a number of us, Andrea Quinlan's work I love. Deborah White and Janice Dumont have been really, I think, at the forefront. Leslie McMillan has written now sometimes collaboratively with Deborah. And one of the things that's drawn me to their work, and we've been in conversation over time, also with the political scientist who also works in the US, is the comparative framework, right? Because I think that this is the claim that that is attributed to science, is that it's this completely generalizable set of methodologies and approaches that can be applied everywhere. But as soon as you read about forensic practice, locally, I was reading some of Dee Smith's work in South Africa, and I'm very, very shaped by it. Pratiksha Baxi has written about the forensic examination in India and Gujarat. And these are extremely distinctive forms of intervention. Oftentimes, conducted by nurses who received the same training, and medical doctors who they are in conversation with each other. And that has been very helpful as well. To kind of think across time and space, to deflate that fiction about the kind of standardized nature of science. And scientists know that that's not how that works. So it's kind of the public that comes in with these hopes and dreams. So I think we're all drawn to the science and technology questions for this range of reasons.
Yeah. For the telephone going off. We never get a telephone call here, so we've had 2 in the last half hour. But anyway, just one final sort of question. I mean, what would you say to an early career researcher who is thinking, I'd love to work on a particular aspect of sexual violence? What kind of advice would you give this researcher?
I would say welcome. There's always more to do. And I think finding a community is one of the most important things to do. It's challenging work. And I think the work benefits when you expect it to be challenging. And I always like to teach around issues of what happens when you do find yourself potentially emotionally overwhelmed in a fieldwork site. And, of course, this can happen regardless of what your topic is. And I think one of the fictions of research, we do all come from distinctive paradigms, is that emotion has no place in in scholarly pursuits. And for someone who is trained and oriented like me, that kind of distinction between sensing and knowing and feeling is a very Western European Enlightenment framework, where if I read my Indigenous colleagues who are making observations about knowledge production, there is a nesting of observation, experience, and also emotion in the same project. And so for example, the Northern Athabascan scientists will often talk about intellection and how one layers sensing upon emotion and upon observation. And these things are what saves your life. If you're out without the right gear and a storm comes on quite quickly, right? I mean, these are absolutely about life and death. Take that with me into my field research, and I think preparing scholars who are new to the field to sort of invite them to explore those feelings, even if you can't do it in an immediate way, to come back to it, to make a note of it, because that might be a kind of an intuition there, that you're encountering something that, yes, it might be about you and your need for support, but actually there might be some kind of, especially in anthropology and sociology, there might be something there that requires more analysis and unpacking. And I would also say read very broadly and diversely. Because I work in the United States, but I make it a point to read global approaches and literatures, and it really opens my eyes to what moving parts I might not take note of, right? And it helps me kind of break out of this ethnocentric framework, because I know that with US scholarship, there is this tendency, we don't like to provincialize ourselves. But, the secret is every state is a completely different kind of setting. So we should be provincializing myself. And I'm working in Wisconsin now. So, I'm really finding that there are some similarities with the work that I did in Maryland around the violence of care. But there are ways in which the local landscape really departs from what I had experienced and documented in Baltimore. So that'll be really interesting to think with in the next stages.
And we look forward to your next book. I particularly do. Look, Sameena Mulla, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And I just hope that we can keep this conversation going. Thanks a lot. And we'll speak some other time, I hope.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.